Well, it's great to be with you all, and thank you so much for bearing with my schedule with the high school students. Right now, they're over there in an exercise that we arranged for them, where they are members of the Security Council, and they're debating whether or not to, or what to do about the fact that Muammar Gaddafi, this is March, they're back, we're rewriting history. They're back in March, and the Security Council is debating what to do about the rebellion in Libya and the fact that the Gaddafi government is attacking and massacring innocent people in the streets. So, quite interesting. And sure enough, the Americans are very militaristic, and the Chinese don't want to do much. So they're very much in character. They're not going to do that. But I'm happy to share with you this morning some of our experiences and our perspectives on addressing the questions of social change in the curriculum. And it's really an important part of what we do here at the Kroc Institute. For now more than 15 years, we've been offering the course for our MA students and also for undergraduates that's called the Strategy and Tactics of Nonviolent Social Change. And now, just in the last year, we've also added a course for our MA students only that relates to the policy change track. We have a track in our MA curriculum on policy change. And so now we're kind of adapting that previous course to the MA students and to focus more on policy. So it includes some of the basic background issues of how to organize for social change, but it also includes a lot of elements of specific policy dilemmas that are now facing individual nations and the United Nations and the international community more broadly. So I'll be sharing with you some of the perspectives from those courses, and also, as George mentioned, our recent experience in Cairo at an amazing symposium on the unarmed revolution. So yeah, this book I know some of you use in your courses, and it's in the second edition. And it's not only shameless self-promotion, but also the fact that the publisher called me right out around the time when Egypt was going through its amazing revolution, saying, is it time for a third edition? So well, we just finished the second edition a couple of years ago. But you know, maybe it is time, and I'll explain as we go through. And we were actually joking the other day that because of what we're learning about the nature of the social change process in Egypt and Tunisia and so far unsuccessful struggles in other countries in the region, we might have to change the title to Gandhi and Far Beyond. But it is a crucial topic, and before I get into the substance, I thought I'd say a word about my own background, because maybe like some of you, I often get the question from students, well, how did you get into the peace studies thing? Which is maybe in a way, a polite way of saying, why don't you get a real job? And in my case, I always have a ready answer that kind of blows their mind, which is that I was drafted into the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War in 1968. And that is what made me a convinced advocate for peace. So I graduated actually from Notre Dame, 68, and those of you who remember back to the ancient history know that that was a very unfortunate time to be an available young man in America, because the military draft was in high gear, and they were grabbing every walking person, and since I had just finished college, I was prime target, and literally within 3 days of returning from graduation, in the mailbox is a summons from the Selective Service System to report for the military draft and my physical. So a couple months later, there I am in the Army in Fort Dix, New Jersey, in basic training, wondering what hit me, trying to figure out what's happening. I was a conservative, Catholic, working class kid. I really didn't have any political views, even going through the university here. And so I thought, well, everybody else is in the Army. All my friends had already been drafted. My brother was in the Army. I had just a couple of weeks there before I got drafted into the Army when I'm back home in Pennsylvania. And one of the good things about it was that since every other guy in town was already in the Army, I could date any girl I wanted. But the bad thing was that it only lasted a few weeks. But it really was a shock, and immediately, as I'm beginning to experience what it's like in the Army, and I'm especially hearing from what the soldiers who are coming back from Vietnam are saying, questions are starting to churn in my mind. You know, they're telling us we're there to defend communism, to defend democracy, to defeat communism. We're the good guys. And of course, the more I'm learning is that we're not, and that this is a tragic war, that we're killing many innocent people. So the questions started to grow. And then I did a very subversive thing. I started to read. And I started to look into the history of Indochina. And within the first couple hours of reading a book, I think it was by Bernard Fall, a great French analyst, I realized, well, everything they're saying, from the commanders who are in front of me to what the president is saying, seems to be incorrect. The more I read, the more questions. So within a few months of being in the Army, I'm going through what a colleague later told me is a crisis of conscience. The more I understood and learned, the more I began to feel this is not only unjust, this is a criminal war. We're bombing innocent people. I began to sympathize actually with the other side. It seemed to me Ho Chi Minh was like their George Washington. So what to do? I'm in the Army. I may be sent over any time. I thought about being a conscientious objector, but I was not then, and I really don't think I am now, an absolute pacifist. But they always ask you the question when you apply for CO, would you have fought in World War II? And I would have to say yes. So, and also the Catholic Church at that time was not exactly sympathetic to anti-war sentiment. So I thought about deserting, but I didn't want to leave my family and everything. So I came up with this crazy idea that, but it wasn't so crazy actually, because there were others doing it, that even though I'm an active duty soldier, I'm in the Army, I have to follow orders, I can speak out against the war. So I began to do that. And there were other soldiers and recent veterans doing the same. This is late '68. And there was, at this time, a growing GI peace movement. Sounds crazy, right? It's one of those unknown chapters in the history of the Vietnam era. But a very significant movement against the war emerged inside the U.S. military. And I was a part of it. First, I was stationed at Fort Hamilton in New York, actually right near George's old hometown. It's a neighborhood in Brooklyn. And didn't know him at that time yet.
I was in diapers.
Right. So out of that came this group at Fort Hamilton, GIs United Against the War. And we began to sign petitions and all. And as you can imagine, our military commanders were not exactly thrilled at this action by the soldiers. So they began to punish us with petty work details. And then when we produced a petition that was in the full-page ads in the New York Times in November of '69. You may remember that was the time of the big moratorium march in Washington, D.C., one of the largest rallies against the war. And on the Sunday before, full-page ad signed by 1,300 active duty service members, bring the troops home now. I was one of those who signed that and helped to organize it. So that was enough for the military. So they issued orders to transfer all of us, quote, subversives, away from Fort Hamilton. Because the problem with Fort Hamilton is right in New York. All the newspapers are there. All the anti-war groups are there. All the lawyers are there. So they didn't want us near this. Thankfully, they didn't send us to Vietnam. Actually, it turns out that at this time, this is '69, and actually even in late '69, there are so many anti-war soldiers already in Vietnam, and the morale of the Army is sinking rapidly that they didn't want to send, quote, troublemakers over to Vietnam. So they sent me to Fort Bliss, Texas. So the main distinction of Fort Bliss is it's far away from any newspapers or television reporters. But we ended up suing the Army. There's a whole long story. I won't go into all of that. But essentially, what I ended up doing is I spent a year or so in the Army doing regular stuff. I was actually in the Army band, defending the country by playing my trumpet. But then the last couple of years that I was in the Army, I was basically organizing against the war, filing a lawsuit against the U.S. Army, and learning that the problem of war is a deep and profound one in our society. And learning about the problems of militarism, and learning about the history of war and the even greater threats that exist around nuclear weapons and other means of mass destruction. So I began to have a vocation. Going into the Army, I had no idea what I was going to do. I came out of this crisis of conscience committed to work for peace, to try to study peace, and now to try to teach peace and the process of social change. So it's a strange odyssey, but it's one that I've been committed to for now over 40 years and really have not changed course since. And any of us who are studying war and peace, and especially the process of nonviolent change, must address and understand Gandhi and try to discern the most effective insights that he offers about the philosophy, but also the practice of nonviolent change. Now, those of you who have studied Gandhi know it's a difficult task. I remember trying maybe 5 times to read the autobiography, Story of My Experiments in Truth. How many of you have tried to read it? Well, those of you who haven't tried, don't. Read one of the great biographies of Gandhi. Judith Brown, the one by Nanda, B.R. Nanda in India, and also even by Raj Mohan Gandhi, his grandson. There's a wonderful book called The Good Boatman. Marvelous. And then there's another book that he wrote called Mohandas. So Raj Mohan Gandhi, the grandson, is, I think, really the most important chronicler of Gandhi's life and of his many insights. And he's writing today, so he's bringing it up to date to our condition in the world. But Gandhi is essential in so many respects because he was the first to take the idea of non-cooperation with evil, which is a permanent part of human experience, and to raise that to a level of strategic force for change, to organize it on a mass scale. Initially among the immigrant communities of Asians in South Africa in the late 1890s and early part of the 20th century, and then when he came back to India for the whole nation. And his genius was his ability to find a way in which the whole country could be mobilized to say no to British colonialism. And this was perhaps most effectively manifest during the Great Salt Satyagraha in 1930. And there's no specific photo from that there, but this was when, of course, the Great Salt March occurred. And the point of it was to come up with a tactic, refusing to cooperate with the British on the salt tax, that everybody in the country could understand and that everybody could participate in. Anybody could make salt illegally. Anyone could refuse to pay the salt tax. And of course the British authorities said, well, this is ridiculous. You can't bring down the British Empire by boycotting salt. But Gandhi said the point is to provide a way for people to say no, to mobilize them into social action. And even if it's on a small thing, it begins to build momentum. And of course, during that campaign, quite literally, millions of people participated. Tens of thousands were arrested. Those who weren't involved in making salt were also engaged in boycotting British cloth, liquor, hurting the British economy to a substantial degree by the effectiveness of the boycotts. So he was really pioneering through these actions the ways in which people could say no to injustice in a purely nonviolent way. And Gandhi, in developing this technique, his point was really not to deal with war and peace. I mean, he was a pacifist, but he also was a supporter of the military. As you know, he was part of an ambulance corps. He had a division of some Asian troops who were part of the Boer War in South Africa. His main concern was to fight against injustice, against the oppression of Asian immigrants in South Africa and against colonialism in India. So this is a method of nonviolent resistance, which is a tool for achieving justice. And it's really not correct, I believe, to equate it with pacifism. Pacifism has the connotation of passivity sometimes, and it sometimes suggests not wanting to get involved in conflict. But Gandhi said, yes, we have to be very much involved in conflict. But we can be effective in working for justice through nonviolent means. And you can understand, of course, the connections between this Gandhian idea of fighting for justice through nonviolent means and the whole method and philosophy of conflict transformation Lederach and others have developed. It's the same basic idea of recognizing that conflict exists, that it's necessary at times to press a conflict to achieve justice, but that it's best done and most effectively done through a nonviolent means. There were many strategic insights and principles that developed from Gandhi's experience. Gandhi himself was a doer more than a thinker and writer, although he wrote 100 volumes. But he never systematically put down the principles of nonviolent action, the tactics and strategy. But that job was performed by Gene Sharp, Professor Gene Sharp, who went to India earlier in his life and studied carefully what Gandhi had done and wrote a seminal book called Gandhi as Strategist, and a whole series of essays, and then of course The Politics of Nonviolent Action, and many other works up till today that are fundamentally grounded in the experience and the principles that Gandhi applied in struggling for justice in South Africa and then in India. And of course these ideas then were significantly transferred and applied here in the United States by Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. So as part of our pedagogy and our teaching, we spend some time with Gandhi, but usually it's only a couple days. We show some of the Attenborough film about Gandhi, especially the first 30 minutes, which is marvelous in describing some of the methods. We also show parts of the Force More Powerful video series. But then we jump very quickly to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement, because this helps to make it more directly applicable to our U.S. students. It's part of our American history and culture, heritage, so it allows it to become more concrete. And there are so many powerful and wonderful examples of the effective use of nonviolent resistance during the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King himself, as we know, was profoundly influenced by Gandhi. He read a lot about Gandhi early while he was still in graduate school. And on the wall of his office, he had a photo of Jesus and a photo of Gandhi. And often talked about how he was influenced profoundly both by his Christian beliefs, upbringing, but also by what Gandhi had done. And he was very effective in applying these methods in very specific campaigns in the South, of course, Birmingham and all the rest. And this allows us to show the students how much this method has been effective. Because part of what we always hear from the students, well, nonviolence, it's nice in theory, Gandhi, this beautiful belief they had, but it's not practical. They may have worked there. The British they're so nice and lawful. It's true, but that's the impression that people have. You could never work against Hitler or Stalin or any great tyrants, dictators. But then we say, well, but it worked in the US. And the segregationist system was brutal and vicious. And many African Americans were killed over many decades trying to speak up for freedom. Even in the civil rights movement, as we know, there were 55 martyrs, 55 people who died. There's, of course, the memorial to those who died in the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. King himself was brought down by an assassin's bullet. So it shows that it's effective, but it also shows how much sacrifice is necessary and how much a struggle is part of the process. Nonviolent action can be very effective, but it always requires a considerable degree of struggle. I'm sure many of you teach the letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King's wonderful letter. I read it 2 or 3 times a year, every year, because I'm teaching it, and always get new insights from it. Among the many wonderful elements in that letter, you recall where he talks about the need for creative tension. That change only comes about when we who are struggling for justice are able to disrupt the normal functioning of society, and we can generate creative tension. It's tension in that it causes some degree of conflict in society, but it's creative in that it's nonviolent and that it's oriented towards solution. It's not simply rioting for its sake or anger. It's actually directed by love and by a passion for constructive change, by a willingness to engage in dialogue with the adversary. Even the most hateful segregationist must be someone that we love. Dr. King preached, following, of course, the teachings of Jesus. So he always had that spirit of love, creativity, and nonviolence, and dialogue, and yet was engaged in a very bitter struggle often with the segregationist authorities in so many of the southern states and cities. So very important lessons that we can distill from the experience of Dr. King's civil rights movement. And today we're seeing these methods applied on a scale that we've never witnessed before. And this is with especially the revolution in Egypt. As George mentioned, the Kroc Institute was able to sponsor this symposium in Cairo a few weeks ago. Our colleague, Imad Shaheen, is, of course, Egyptian himself, and we worked with him to establish a partnership with Cairo University. And we also worked with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I'll say more about that in a moment. And our goal was to really try to focus in on the transformation in Egypt itself. What happened in those remarkable 18 days? From January 25th to February 11th, how the whole country mobilized and brought down a dictatorship that seemed impregnable just a few weeks before. There are a lot of other questions that we have about what's going on in the Middle East today. What will be the transition in Egypt itself? Will it really evolve toward democracy? We don't know. Why has it been such a painful process in Libya, and Yemen, and Syria, and these other places? Those are critical questions, but we thought let's try to keep the focus narrow and let's really try to learn what lessons we can from the unarmed revolution in Egypt. And I'll say more as we go along here. But it was really an extraordinary event, and I'm still sort of high from the opportunity to be able to meet with the, quote, revolutionaries, most of whom were about the age of our students, in the 20s, who were the ones who really made a revolution. And, I'll share more of that as I go along. One thing that was immediately crystal clear to me was how much of a grim and difficult struggle this was. The students who went out into the streets on January 25, Professor Shaheen was talking to one of the students, and he was saying, well, you know, we try to protest a lot in Egypt over the years. We haven't gotten very far. So they called for protests on this day. And one of the students said, well, I'm going to bring along my Pictionary game, because probably it's going to be boring. We won't have any people out here. You know, we can sit around and play the game while we're out there in the streets. Well, obviously, didn't get a chance to play that game that day, because it really took off. There are reasons for that, but this was a brutal struggle, and many were killed. I was talking to these 20-something students. Some were showing the wounds that they had received. One young man had torture marks on his back and a buckshot from a shotgun wound in his leg. Another girl had a big lump on her face from a rubber bullet. Another one said a guy right next to me had a bullet in the head and died immediately. They were up against live ammunition and rubber bullets and massive attacks that were coming from the Egyptian police force. And yet they were able to retain control of the streets, so to speak. They'd be driven out of one street, they'd come through another street. They were driven out of Tahrir Square a couple times. They'd go out to the side streets and slowly kind of sneak back in and reclaim the territory. But many important lessons that I'll try to distill more carefully here in a moment. Generally, of course, the most important aspect of nonviolent social change that we can share with our students is how much this has become the default process by which social change is organized in the world today. There's been a revolution in the revolution, if you will. Even just a few decades ago, we think back to the Cuban Revolution or earlier ones in history, it was natural of those who were in oppressed countries who wanted to bring about change. You form an insurgent force, you form a guerrilla army, and you take up arms against the state. And of course that still happens, but now more and more people recognize that the most effective way to bring about change is through nonviolent action. And this is certainly the case in Egypt. The idea that the people of Egypt would have taken up arms against Mubarak really never occurred. It was instinctive and understood that this is the best way to go because of what they had seen in Tunisia right next door just a few weeks before, but also because of what they've seen around the world. They have their eyes open, they know it. And this book that Ackerman and Duvall have written, and the video series that goes with it, how many of you use this? It's a really important, wonderful teaching tool. The 6-part video series that goes with it. It describes how the method of nonviolent resistance has been used literally all across the world to great success. It's not always effective, doesn't always win, of course, but it really is the most effective way to bring about change and has shown more power than military means. The group that we worked with in Cairo is the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. Peter Ackerman is the chair of the organization. Jack Duvall is the president. It is, I think, the most well-connected and important organization now for sharing the knowledge of civil resistance methods for people all around the world. They've taken some of Gene Sharp's work. They've been helping to promote the translation of Sharp's works now into, I think, more than 20 languages, including Arabic. And they are organizing trainings. I think actually this week, while we're doing our workshop here, they're doing a workshop at Tufts University for those who are using methods of nonviolent social change. And they're interested in not only the academic enrichment, but also with the actual practitioners. So in their workshops, they bring people from Arab countries, from the Caucasus, from Burma, wherever there may be a struggle for social change occurring around the world. They try to help by teaching the methods, the practices of nonviolent resistance. So if you're not familiar with ICNC, I would encourage you to look through the website. It's very rich, many good teaching and academic materials there, various curricular items and some syllabi. And they also have a news digest. So about every 2 or 3 days I get this quick listing of all the different articles around the world. It's a bit too much, but if you're interested in being totally up to date with every nonviolent struggle in the world, this is the place for you. And they were wonderful partners for us when we were in Cairo. Steve Zunis, maybe some of you know his work. It's written so widely on a whole range of social change issues, and actually is quite familiar with the Middle East. He gave some wonderful presentations during our workshop in Cairo. There are many other valuable teaching tools. This is about a 1-hour film that was produced with support from Peter Ackerman and the earlier version of the International Center. And it's a story of how nonviolent resistance, again led by students, brought down the Milosevic dictatorship in Serbia. How many of you use this film? Yeah. I find with the students, this is the one that kind of seals the deal, so to speak. You know, they're interested, you know, Gandhi, yeah, it's kind of cool, and the civil rights movement. But then you show this one, and it kind of something clicks. And I guess it's because there are the young people who are leading it. They're cool, they're hip. They're even, this is early hip hop, so they're with the current culture. And the ways in which the whole country basically mobilized to finally bring down Milosevic. And it was kind of a rough, and it wasn't purely Gandhian in the sense of just sit down and be arrested or clubbed. They took the bulldozers and all the trucks and everything and came in and attacked the main presidential building. It was partially set on fire, but no weapons were used, no one was killed, and it was extremely effective in getting rid of the dictator. So it's a really good teaching tool. Now, of course, we have to be clear about the limitations of nonviolent resistance as well. Students will catch on if you don't do it yourself, so it's better to just bring it right up, that there are many failures. There are more successes than failures. We'll say that and show that in a minute, but there are failures, and there are also great successes that people don't know about. So here we are on the positive side, the revolution in Nepal in April of '06, where the king tried to dissolve, and did dissolve the parliament, tried to regain total power, and the people rose up in resistance, and in a mass movement that's has a lot of similarities to what happened just recently in Cairo. They were able to bring down the monarchy and have established a democracy. It's been messy and a difficult transition. 5 years on, they're still working to try to get a constitution together, but the process of the change itself was remarkably effective and reflected a mass mobilization of the Nepalese people. Not successful has been the extraordinary democracy movement in Burma, or at least not so far. The most recent wave of the resistance came in '07 with the so-called Saffron Revolution, led by the Buddhist monks, marching even through the monsoons, but ultimately unsuccessful. The military was able to repress, shoot, arrest sufficient numbers to be able to beat back the resistance, at least for now. But obviously, the democracy movement remains strong. Aung San Suu Kyi has been released from house arrest. Such a courageous and powerful woman. The moment she's freed, she gets up and says, we need to have free and fair democratic elections. She goes out and meets with her supporters in various rallies. And so showing that the fight goes on. It may yet succeed. What's happened in some cases is that, especially in the Middle East, now we're shifting over to Cairo, and I'll try to focus a lot now on what we learned during our symposium. There's been this extraordinary success within Egypt and Tunisia, but in other settings, as we know, the rebellion has turned violent. And in Libya, it began as a nonviolent resistance, but of course the Gaddafi regime reacted brutally, and within a couple of weeks the rebels have turned to the use of arms. And I don't feel that any of us are in a position to be able to judge those who decide they have to take up arms to defend themselves under such circumstances. But the fact of the matter is it's become bogged down. There's a stalemate. And rebels may yet win, but it's been a long and difficult struggle, and casualty rates are constantly rising. So it's been a hard choice for the Libyans to make to use arms. We've also seen in the conflicts in Yemen and Syria especially, and to some extent Libya, the ways in which tribal and other divisions within society affect the dynamics of social resistance. And one of those key variables is the relationship between the state and society. Professor Shaheen has helped me to try to understand this as one who knows the Middle East. In Egypt, there has been more of a sense of unity between the people and the state, especially between the army and the state. Obviously, it's a long-established country. But in some of the other countries around the region, states were formed only relatively recently in the wake of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Tribal divisions that were prominent previously remain significant, and we've seen some of these struggles now fracture along the different social lines within the state. And then the ruling elites like Gaddafi or Assad in Syria can take advantage of those differences in order to repress the rebels and stay in power. So again, the nonviolent method doesn't always work. And there are occasions when those who are resisting oppression will feel compelled to take up arms. But the many contradictions and difficulties that are involved with that can manifest themselves. There's been a very significant amount of research just recently on the impacts of nonviolent social change and trying to get an empirical database together to demonstrate or to find out how nonviolent resistance rates compare to the use of armed struggle. In this article, I presume many of you have seen this by Chenoweth and Stefan in the journal International Security. Now that's quite significant. This is one of the top line security journals. I've been trying to get published there for a couple of years, still haven't gotten accepted yet. But those of us who write in the security field want to get published there. It's a top line. And they published this article, and it's been one of the most frequently downloaded articles from international security. And the findings are extremely significant. They're self-evident. We're looking at this database of more than 300 cases. They tried to analyze the relative effectiveness of using nonviolent means versus violent means, and finding that the nonviolent methods tend to be twice as effective as the use of armed struggle. And they've also found that these rates of relative advantage for nonviolent methods seem to be going up. In more recent years, the numbers are higher than 3%. And there's a book now coming out by Stefan and Chenoweth, the same title, that goes into much greater depth and explores other dimensions of their database. And one of the things that they reveal in the further study is that they're trying to look at what are the most important factors that lead to the success. And the most significant one is loyalty shifts within the government and within the military. That the use of a nonviolent strategy greatly increases the likelihood that the Army and the top security forces will be either neutral or will be sympathetic to the movement for change. It makes sense. If you're shooting at the Army, they're not likely to be your friends. But if you're out protesting nonviolently and you are repressed, there can be a kind of a sympathetic wave, a reaction from within elements of the security forces and in the state to begin to move sympathetically and politically in favor of the resistance movement. Now, it turns out this idea of loyalty shifts is really one of the key factors that explains the political dynamics of social change, of nonviolent social change. And this is really important because, again, with the students, their healthy skepticism, saying, so you mean if we go out there and protest nonviolently, all these segregationists in the South, all these dictators, they're suddenly going to have a good conscience someday and they're going to change because they suddenly realize that you're right and they were wrong. Of course, that's not the way it works. What happens is that nonviolent social change seeks to erode the power base of the dictators or of the segregationists or of the forces of oppression. And the principal way it does it is by trying to win the sympathy of the masses of the people, and especially of the people who are in the security forces, who are the main pillars, if you will, of the oppressive establishment. This is what Barbara Deming calls the third party effect. You're trying to win over the third party. Cesar Chavez talked about the, quote, strange chemistry, unquote, of nonviolent action. He said, every time we get beaten up by the growers, we get more support. And the growers lose authority and legitimacy. Strange. It seems counterintuitive to everything we're sort of taught. But that's really the way nonviolent resistance works. And in their empirical research, they're finding that exactly that factor is most important. Now, there's related research that's been done through Freedom House that's looking at changes from authoritarianism toward more open society. These are mostly the changes that have occurred in Latin America and in Eastern Central Europe and the former Soviet system. And most of those have moved towards more open democratic societies. And most have used nonviolent means to bring about that change. And very significantly, in those transitions that have been through nonviolent means, there's a much higher percentage of societies that are rated as free, according to the Freedom House characterizations of the Freedom House rating. You're all familiar with the annual publication of the Freedom House listing. And when there's the use of nonviolent methods, it's a much greater likelihood of the resulting society being freer, more democratic, more open. And again, it's fairly intuitive. Those who bring about change by the gun tend to rule by the gun. On the other hand, the nonviolent process, and the key factor that they identify, is the existence of a large civil coalition committed to nonviolent methods. A large civil coalition means it's a mass movement. It means that you have to have hundreds of thousands, even millions of people participate. It's very open. There's no coercion. People join because they believe in it. So it has within it the very characteristics of a free or an open society. The process of mass nonviolent social life. And it tends to create societies that are free and more open. So nonviolent methods of change are not only more effective in terms of a quantitative analysis, they bring about a better result in terms of the qualitative result, qualitative endpoint, a more democratic and open society. So these empirical findings are important, and I think will be especially of interest to students who may be going on to graduate school. These databases are now available for further mining, so to speak, and there's a lot of research going on to look more deeply into some of the connections that may account for these findings. Now, I want to talk more about the Middle East example. So, focus here in the last 10 or 15 minutes on some of the lessons that we gleaned in Cairo. Of course, it began with the struggle in Tunis. The wags are calling it the Tunis Army. But that in itself was extraordinary. But it sent a message to those in Egypt who have been struggling for change. There's the movement that erupted in January of this year didn't just come out of nowhere. It had been evolving and developing for at least 10 or 15 years. And the various waves of protests that have been occurring in Egypt, a number of organizations, youth groups in particular, had emerged. Labor groups were very active. So there was already some ferment. And then the example next door nearby in Tunisia kind of sent an electric charge through those movements and sparked a desire to try to come out and really see if the same thing could happen in Cairo. And really trying to understand how this happened. How is it possible that people were able to rise up in this way and achieve success? At the time it seemed, well, this is going to happen through the whole Middle East. Unfortunately, it hasn't. So the accomplishment, the enormity of what was achieved in Egypt and Tunisia stands out even more. So we're not really clear yet. This is certainly a work in progress. Professor Shaheen and I will be trying to write up our analysis. There are a number of others who are studying this now. While we were there, George Washington University did a seminar at the American University in Cairo. So there's probably a dozen or more different research programs already underway. There's several books already published in Arabic. So we'll learn more. And so what I'm offering here is very much a tentative, as I say, work in progress, so analysis of what happened. The most important factor certainly seems to be the degree of popular support, the overwhelming mass that was organized. And I think this is a general strategic principle, that it is necessary for social change to succeed to have vast numbers of people. In big cases that we know where there has been success, you have sufficient mass of people to be able to, if not completely overwhelm, at least clog up the police system. In the civil rights movement, Dr. King's goal was always to fill the jails, to overwhelm the police. And in this case, the goal was to occupy and control the urban space, not just in Cairo, but in all the cities of Egypt. The revolution occurred in Alexandria and Suez, all the way up to the Upper Nile, to Aswan. Every major city had huge protests, huge gatherings in their central square, equivalent to what we saw on the news here in Tahrir Square. We found varying estimates on the total number of people who were involved, but the lowest number was about 7 million, and some were claiming up to 15 million. So whether we'll ever really know exact numbers is doubtful, but certainly we can say that this is probably the largest outpouring of civic resistance ever. And the amazing thing is that it began with, I think really it's fair to say, a few hundred dedicated students in some of the groups, the April 6th Coalition, Youth for Change. Mohammed El-Baradei returned to Egypt after he retired from the International Atomic Energy Agency and very courageously spoke for democracy, and a youth group began to form in support of him. And these groups were increasingly organized through Facebook and social media. And they numbered tens of thousands of friends. But really the leaders, and those who administered the Facebook pages and all, were relatively a small number, a few hundred. And they described how they thought about the process of beginning the protest. January 25th, why was that day picked? That's Police Day. There was an ironic twist to this, because the police in Egypt were known as brutal and had already attacked and tortured many protesters. So the idea was to come out on Police Day to demand that the oppressive head of the Ministry of Interior be fired and that the police be reformed. And there was also a demand that the wages be increased and that the cost of living rise in the price of necessary goods be restricted and limited. So there were bread and butter issues, and there were also issues related to police repression. And they decided, well, we'll have this protest on January 25, and they communicated through Facebook. Of course, they knew that the police are reading as well. So they very cleverly decided, rather than gather initially in Tahrir Square, they'll gather in some other smaller neighborhoods in Cairo and in Alexandria, Aswan, and Suez, and other cities. Often they would pick the poor neighborhoods because they had the bread and butter message. They were very clever. They would scope out the neighborhoods and see where the police were gathering. So they didn't go there. They went to the squares where there were no police. And in the mosques, there were maybe smaller mosques that were in the poorer neighborhoods. That's where the student, as I said, brought out his Pictionary game. And they gathered at those squares and those mosques and began to chant. We want to work for the people. Come and join us. And to their amazement, people began to come out of the apartments, buildings, and began to join them. And the crowds were much bigger than they anticipated. And people were enthusiastic, and then more people were joining them. And the students described it to us as, well, we knew we wanted to go towards Tahrir Square, and we just sort of figured out what route we should go right there on the spot. And it was sort of depending on where the police were. And our goal was to try to get into the square before the police could start to crack down on us, and see if we could get a big crowd together in the square. And as you know from the story, they did. By that afternoon, there were tens of thousands of people gathering at Tahrir Square, to the amazement of everybody, including the organizers. And then the police began to crack down. There was an incredible, brutal period of attack that went on for several days. I'll show some more images of that. So mass numbers is a key strategic factor. You have to be able to fill the square. The other key factor is the nonviolent discipline. We saw this again in the news clips, that the constant chant was peaceful, peaceful. And we asked the students, well, you know, where did you get this? Had you read Gandhi? Or had you read Gandhi and Beyond? Had you read Gene Sharp? Remember there were stories in the Western press about Gene Sharp. Actually, every student we talked to said never heard of Gene Sharp until after the revolution. But you know, we interviewed about 15 students, so you know, millions. So some did, and there was one group that was the Academy for Change, came to our symposium, and they said they're based in Doha. They had done some teaching of at least some people around the Gene Sharp methods. But mostly it was an instinctive, intuitive sense that this was necessary to win. We can't compete with the Egyptian army or the police with weapons. And we also have a goal of winning over the people. We can't win unless the people join us. We're students, we're a few tens of thousands. One young woman, a 24-year-old woman, said it very beautifully. She said, we were in an image war with the government. They portrayed us as terrorists, as thugs, as violent, foreigners. We wanted to tell the people that we were their children. We were the children of Egypt. We love our country. And the only way we could communicate this was through our actions. Because the government immediately cut off the internet the first couple days. And they didn't have access to Al Jazeera or the press initially. So they had to communicate through their actions. So they really organized it. And this image is one you may have seen. The people formed a human chain around the National Museum. This is the museum where priceless artifacts of Egyptian civilization, Tutankhamun, and so many other great treasures are housed. And just on their own, the students described this on that first day. People said, well, we need to protect the National Museum. And they just ran over there and they started forming a chain. Nobody planned this, nobody organized it, it just happened. And it stayed for days. The key thing is struggle. And it was a brutal and horrendous struggle. I asked one advisor of the government, you know, how many people were killed and injured. They don't have exact numbers yet, but he said the estimates that they're going on now in the government is 850 people were killed, 9,000 were injured. I asked about, you know, what's the makeup, how many police, how many students, whatever. So well, we do know that there were 22 police and security officers killed. But most of those, apparently, were during the prison breaks. You may have seen in the press, there were several major prison breaks. There's rumors that the police may have opened up some of the prisons just to let criminals out. We saw this, Saddam Hussein did this. That's undocumented yet, we really don't know for sure. But there were prison breaks, and in those prison breaks there was shooting and people were killed. Apparently that was a lot of the casualties occurred around those prison breaks. He said there were 2 police officers who died in Cairo. amidst all of those protests for 18 days, literally millions of people, bitter clashes like this, only 2 police officers died. So it was a largely nonviolent, unarmed action. But the fact is that the people did protect themselves. And when they were attacked by the police, starting on the 25th, especially up to the 28th, 28th and 29th were the worst. There are running battles on the bridges going into Tahrir Square. It really was a war. And for a while, the police were pushing all the way back towards Gaza on the other side of the river. And then the people would slowly start coming back. And in the face of water cannons and live ammunition, rubber bullets, tear gas, they kept pushing back and pushing back. And the police were getting exhausted. They were running out of ammunition, literally. Their cell phones were running out of battery and charge. And the people just kept coming and coming, and they got back into the square late that night. But many suffered, many were injured, and many did pick up rocks to throw at the police. Almost every police station around Cairo and in most of the country was burned. The Ministry of the Interior, a big building there right on the square, that was attacked, and it was eventually abandoned by the government. You could still see a lot of broken windows and a few burned out cars down below it. The National Democratic Party, so-called, which is Mubarak's one-party apparatus, that was also burned. And you can still see the torching, the marks of black smoke on the outside of that building. So this was, and they used pipes and sticks and sheet metal, anything they could grab to protect themselves from the police. Also, you may have seen these horrendous images on television when Mubarak's thugs attacked with horses and camels, the so-called Battle of the Camel. And actually, even when they started, the protesters said, peaceful, peaceful. They wanted to try to talk with them. But those thugs had only one purpose in mind, and that was to kill and injure as many people as possible and drive them out of the square. And when that started on the 2nd of February, about an hour in, the protesters realized that there was no dialogue with these people, and they began to protect themselves. That's when the activists from the Muslim Brotherhood really began to support the rally, the protests, and they came into the square to help defend the protesters. And there was a pitched battle that went on at least 12, 14 hours that night, all the way into the 3rd, between the protesters and the thugs. So it was a bitter struggle. All throughout Cairo and in most of the cities, people then organized so-called popular committees to protect their neighborhoods, because the thugs were not only in Tahrir Square, but in many other places. And yes, in those popular committees, they had pipes, sticks, they would get baseball bats, whatever they could to fend off any of the attacks. I was telling George, one of our former students is in Egypt, and he picked me up at the airport and we're driving in, and he was telling me all about this. And he said, well, I was one of the popular committee leaders in my neighborhood. And he said, but I have to tell you, Professor, we did have knives. And I said, well, I understand from what I've read. And, but there were no offensive actions taken by the protesters against the police or the thugs. It was self-protection. And as I thought about this, I realized, going back to Gandhi, this is probably not a revolution that Gandhi would have supported. You know from the history how he sometimes called off whole actions in India. In the first big non-cooperation campaign in 1921 or 22, I think it was, he called off the actions when there was an attack against the police in a particular community. Now, in that case, they did actually attack and kill the police. Here in Egypt, people attacked the police stations and their cars and their offices, and they used rocks and sticks against the police and the thugs. So it's beyond Gandhi, maybe far beyond, and that's my title thing. But I think it still fits a model of unarmed civic resistance. There's a lot of debate that we need to have about these questions. Where do we draw the line? When have we gone over the line towards the use of violent means? Do people have the right to use use police rocks or whatever to protect themselves when being viciously attacked by thugs and police forces. But what happened during the course of these struggles is that the police essentially either gave up or were withdrawn. It's still unclear what happened. Professor Shaheen, he thinks they were just defeated. You know, they could not control the streets. And after 4 or 5 days of battle, literally, some of their commanders began to withdraw, and eventually they all withdrew. And on that night of the 29th and the 30th, the transition occurred where the police withdrew and the army entered. And the army was a different force. The army was not involved in the repression the way the police had been. And I learned from our colleagues there that there is this tradition of the army and the people working together. Remember back in '55 in Nasser's revolution of the colonels, when they seized power, people came out to support them. In 2011, the people tried to take power, and the army came out and supported them, protected them. So very soon after the army came in, first they cleared out the square with firing into the air. So people ran, students told me, my God, you would imagine a horrendous fuselage sound of all those weapons being fired. But it was all into the air. So the students ran off into the side streets, kind of looking as to what's going on. The tanks were set up around some of the buildings to protect them. Then the students said they all started to come back in, talking to the police, to the soldiers. And they began to offer ways of trying to, I'll jump right up to the hug a soldier. There really was a conscious effort by the protesters as they were seeing the army in the square to befriend them, hug them, kiss them. Little children were brought to the soldiers so that they could hold them and see that the people were really not aiming to attack the army. Their goal was to bring down the regime. And so there was a really conscious effort to befriend and work with the military. And again, this wasn't something they figured out from reading our books. It was part of their culture and their tradition, and it was also their understanding and their hope that the army would come in and save them from the police. It's funny that the students originally said to the army, "Now we want you to go out and attack the police because they've been attacking us." And the army said, "No, that's not our job. We're here to protect the buildings, but we won't fire on you." And then you would know that there was the actual official announcement from the commanders of the army that we will not attack the great Egyptian people. And that really basically opened up the possibilities of great change. And I mentioned earlier the social media. It was absolutely indispensable. But every one of the social media activists said that the revolution is not made on Facebook. It's made in the streets. And the social media are critical for especially putting together friends groups and being able to share information and intelligence. Part of their scoping out neighborhoods was on cell phones and text messages as to where the police are so they can go somewhere else. That sort of thing. But without the mass mobilization, without going into those poor neighborhoods, without calling on people in the apartments to come down into the streets and join them, there would have not been a revolution. And of course, the other thing to keep in mind, and not to overstate the social medias, the government cut off the social media. So for the first week, they couldn't communicate on Facebook. And often cell phones weren't working. So social media is important, but it's not the definitive fact. And here's my final thought. There was a statement by El-Baradei right after the revolution. He was interviewed, and he said, "What's happening here in Egypt may be the most important thing in the world for undermining Al-Qaeda and the global terrorist threat." Back to the earlier image. That's, of course, Ayman al-Zawahiri. who was actually tortured in Mubarak's jails and became bin Laden #2, now is the leader of Al-Qaeda. And their narrative, as you know, is in order to overcome the dictatorships, we have to assassinate, kill, bring down not only the government, but kill many thousands of innocent people along the way. It's been a complete and utter failure, led to nothing but suffering and death of mostly Muslim people around the world, versus the notion of democracy and social change and greater freedom, an opportunity for the Egyptian people now to organize their society, to express themselves, to get rid of a corrupt dictatorship. And we hope now, and still don't know, but we hope that the process will move forward towards genuine democracy. So thank you very much. Sorry I went on so long.
The floor is open.
Well, in concurrence with what you're saying, David, just the Khaled Said's death also in June of 2010 was a trigger also, not just the Tunisian thing. I think that helped escalate things because a lot of people, and Baragay also visited at that point, escalated the point that basically the police are very brutal without any grounds even for being there.
You all know Khaled Said. Want to explain?
Khaled Said was a young blogger and he was a political activist, and the police had proven somehow that the police were involved in a drug deal, and the police knew that, so they attacked him, and then they, his picture is gruesome.
They dragged him out of an internet cafe and murdered him.
Yeah. And it wasn't even done within the confines of the police station. Everybody saw things happening. So they drove people in the streets. But just a joke, President Nasser allegedly died from poison. President Sadat died by gunshot. And so when Mubarak allegedly died, he went to heaven, heaven or hell. I'm not quite sure. And he was asking the other presidents, they were asking him, Mubarak, how did you die? By poison or by gunshot? And he said, no, I was Facebook. I imagine you've heard a lot more when you were there.
Yeah, and actually, one of those, there were several groups that were also organized on Facebook, friends groups, and one of them was, we are all Khaled Said.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of them.
Question about Libya. One of the things that bothered me, I've not normally had problems seeing non-militaristic alternatives that we should have taken, but it's not clear to me, it is clear to me that the military response by NATO is wrong and unhelpful, but it's not clear to me what we should have done instead. Can you address that?
Yeah, it's a controversy. We have a lot of debates here at the Institute of what perspectives to take. I must confess, I thought the no-fly zone, at least as a humanitarian measure to prevent the massacres in Benghazi and all, I thought that was justifiable, especially since it had Arab League support. There were others among our colleagues here who disagreed, but of course it's quickly changed into a air support for an ongoing civil war. And that's what NATO is doing now.
And then that's wrong.
Yeah, and bombing. So it's active combat, essentially. It's not civilian protection. There were other ideas, actually. Bob Johansen wrote a piece that was published, I think, in some of the major news sources. He talked about creating a humanitarian corridor along the borders of Libya and maybe along the coast. And this it wouldn't be a completely nonviolent process because you'd have to have security protection. So hopefully some kind of international security force would be necessary. But the idea was that this would be a way to encourage defections by creating safe corridors where Libyans could come. So that was, I think, a useful idea. I think the International Criminal Court proceedings, certainly another dimension, and a lot of people forget that the Security Council, before it approved this no-fly zone, did adopt very quickly a significant resolution for the ICC procedure, but also targeted sanctions. George and I do a lot of research on sanctions, and we were quite impressed at the way in which the Security Council was able to meet quickly and come to a judgment and a decision to impose targeted financial measures and travel sanctions against Gaddafi and a select group of regime insiders. And again, as a way of isolating them, putting pressure on them, and communicating international disapproval. And you know, tens of billions of dollars of Libyan assets were frozen very quickly. And the sanctions provided authority for that. And the US and other states did it immediately. Other states were able to act on the authority. So those are measures as well that could have some impact. And there's an arms embargo that came with the sanctions so that Gaddafi's forces are not allowed to be reinforced in terms of their military footing. So there's a range of options that could be taken, and I was supporting most of those. And you know, having initially spoken for the no-fly zone, then I had to write some op-eds saying that it's not, that's not the same as a combat operation. And I really think ultimately, if this has become a stalemate as it appears, then what's the alternative? There has to be some negotiation. And it means that the US or the UN or some authoritative party needs to begin a dialogue with the Gaddafi regime and see if some kind of arrangement can be negotiated.
Again, there's billions of dollars going into that.
Into the military operation, yes.
Back in the mid-80s, there were campus-based movements focused on the South African apartheid regime, the divestment protests. And my kind of loosely informed sense is that those protests were thought to have some sort of impact and contributed to the collapse of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So my first question is factual. Is that, in fact, an informed consensus view, or is that ambiguous? And then my second question is about a present circumstance and whether there would be if in fact there was a connection there, would there be a similar activist role, say, campus-based again, with regard to, say, Libya or other regimes of repression?
Yeah. Well, certainly the anti-apartheid movement was huge. And at that time, I was the director of SANE in Washington, and while we were focusing mostly on nuclear issues, we couldn't avoid being involved with the anti-apartheid movement as well. And many of the chapters of SANE and Nuclear Freeze were also involved with those campaigns. Very significant. You know, we, George and I did a conference quite a long while ago, maybe 20 years ago, in which we looked at the sanctions broadly in the case of South Africa. And of course, the UN sanctions are very limited. But there were these, if you will, bottom-up sanctions, kind of people's sanctions, the divestment movement. And the estimate from one of the scholars there was that it affected about $20 billion of investment that was not available, that was withdrawn from South Africa. And how much effect it has, we really won't know for certain, but it is significant that in, I think it was 85 and 86, the South African regime is going down economically because of the massive resistance movement inside the country, but also because of this anti-apartheid movement. Investor confidence is declining. Interest rates are going up.
Just clarification, is that 20 billion?
Yes, 20 billion. I think it's Jennifer Davis, who
Yes.
was with the Washington office on Africa, was the scholar that we asked to do that. So anyway, all these things are happening, and when South Africa went to the financial markets to roll over its debt, it had to roll it over short term at a much higher rate. And what we were told is this is what sent the shock signals through the establishment and the business class, that this system was not viable, and their own wealth was at stake. And it was soon after that that dialogue began with Mandela and some of the officials of the ANC. So I think you have to say that the primary factor was certainly the resistance of the South African people themselves. The United Democratic Coalition, United Democratic Front. The goal was to make the society ungovernable, and they did. But certainly the international solidarity movement was a factor that helped. Today there are many student causes. Here on our campus, there's a lot of student activism around East Africa, Uganda, Sudan type issues. There is a boycott movement that's actually, I think, led by academics to try to boycott some of the companies that do business with Israel around the occupation and policies in Gaza. I don't think that's had a lot of traction, but maybe it's having some impact. But there's nothing at all equivalent to what we saw in the 80s. The moral clarity of struggling against apartheid was overwhelming. And we all felt this was absolutely the right thing to do. I don't see anything like that happening today.
In those films by Stephen York on nonviolent revolutions, it really looked like that the economic piece was one of the most important pieces. That's why I really like that question. Because when at least it's pictured that way in those films, that when the people in the neighborhoods couldn't open their stores anymore because nobody was going, and when the bus company realized they were going out of business because and it really looked like that in all the revolutions. And I'm wondering, because the strangle now in our world is around economic control, is there any way that we as a people can do the same kind of investment, if you would, to disempower the power right now?
Well, you're absolutely right to focus on the role of economic power and economic means. I didn't dwell a lot on it, but certainly Gandhi's movements, King's movements, and many others, boycotts were absolutely essential. In all those cities in the South, there was a kind of multi-pronged effort, not only fill up the jails, protest, but boycott the downtown stores. You get the merchants put pressure on political to bring about an end to segregation. In Egypt, worker strikes played a role. As I mentioned, they were important in the lead up to January 25th. In the sense, there were several big strikes in which the students went out to be in solidarity with the workers. Now, there weren't that many strikes initially in January 25, but the longer the revolution went on, the more there were strikes. And in the last couple of days, we're still trying to get documentation on this. There were a lot of strikes, and there were a lot of threats to go on strike, especially among public workers. And of course, the very disruption of the society shut down business as usual. Most shops in central Cairo shut down. In fact, when the government cut off the internet for the protesters, it also cut off the internet for all the hotels, the tourist companies, everybody else, the airlines. So there was profound economic disruption. And that's part of the mass factor that I mentioned. You get enough people active that business as usual shuts down. So these economic tools always exist, and they are used in struggles around the world. And whether they're used here in the U.S., it always depends on the nature of the struggles. But I think one of the strategic considerations always is we can protest, we can all the rest, but unless we also exert some economic power, Dr. King talked about in the South, we don't have any political power because they won't allow us, but we do have economic power. We buy. And we especially buy during the Easter season when we dress up for Easter Sunday, a nice dress or a suit. And that's when they did their boycotts, when they knew it would hurt the most. So it's always the potential for doing it. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up on that. One thing that happened early in Egypt, which was very interesting, this is an uninformed opinion, so I have the facts on it. There was some talk of a threat of the Suez Canal workers striking. And then, for me, a signal of the limits of the military's cooperation and buy-in on this revolution was that they said essentially knock it off. And as far as I can tell, that message was sort of loud and clear. There hasn't been a lot of coverage on it, but I think that's the next one. So the more general question, just in terms of the factors that you admit that you can correct that if that's a wrong assessment, but in terms of the factors that contribute to across the board in North Africa and the Middle East, how much attention in these preliminary efforts to get a sense of what's going on is there being given to the sort of presence or absence of a history of organized labor in these various countries and the way that is affecting the outcomes or tactics that are involved. I mean, certainly in Tunisia there's a history of that. Next door in Libya there's none. And arguably that can be considered a major determining factor in what went down.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I must admit we haven't really studied that much yet. In Egypt, as in many of these countries, the unions were company unions set up by the state. And all the students said, we don't have unions like you would have in Europe or North America. These are all basically like the communist model. So labor activism has always been constrained, but there, as I mentioned, during the decade before the revolution, there was a growing ferment, and there was a strike at Mahalo, and there were a couple of other strikes at the end where the students went out to support workers. But in order to strike, the students had to go against the company and also against their union, their state-sponsored union. So it's very difficult. And we asked, well, did the unions come down to the Tahrir Square when the protests began? They sort of laughed. They wouldn't do that, but many workers did. So it is a critical factor, and the way in which organized labor has been suppressed or tried to be controlled by the state in these countries does limit the potential of the resistance. But I think it became an important factor. And you're right, as far as we know, that there was lots of rumors or talk that the Suez Canal remained open. What the protesters were always struggling with, and they're especially struggling with is now, they knew that you have to kind of shut down the country in order to bring down the dictator. But they also knew that all their jobs and their well-being depended on getting the country back up again. And so even today, I went to the pyramids while I was there, rode on a camel. But I was one of the few tourists out there. And still, the business is very slow. Not yet recovered by any means from what happened.